Hey folks, it's Saturday, March 12th as I'm recording this, and I hope you're all doing well. Another miscellany video, poem updates, and radio things, of course. First, I wanted to talk about a poem I did, both a written version and an audio version I recorded for the Cities in Memory Shortwave transmission project. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about radios, what I have and why I have it. Not really a review, but just a look into my radio shelf. First up is the Tecson PL-380. And finally, I'm going to wrap up with another poetry thing, thinking about what I've been reading and why. I wanted to say too that SWL Fest was this past weekend. I wasn't able to watch live, unfortunately. I was just too busy and had some technical issues. That said, I am looking forward to watching the replays, and I'm glad they had those available. But first, I am pleased to be able to share that I have a poem of sorts in the Cities in Memory Shortwave Transmission Project. I'll put a link to that in the video description. There are lots of wonderful interpretations of news stories, IDs, interval signals, things like the CHU time station. Go check it out. Lots of good stuff to hear there. For my piece, which I called Fierce Fighting in Substantial Numbers, Ships Damaged, kind of a title there. I wanted to take the structure of the news story and think about that critically. The title is from one of the first lines in the BBC World Service news stories that I picked about fighting in the Falkland Islands. The story follows the idea that you lead with the major idea, and that makes it look like you're leading with the loss of equipment, and then only later on do you get to the casualties. This fits with one version of the sonnet, where you start off with one argument, then there's a turn, and you end with something that either complicates or contradicts the argument that you've set up. We end with the loss of life, and that's what you need to walk away from this poem or the story thinking about. I wrote this well before the invasion of Ukraine, but it's really hard not to think about all of this in light of what's happening there. My thoughts do go out to the Ukrainian people, and my heart goes out to them as well. Let me go ahead and grab the poem, and I want to read that. Fierce fighting in substantial numbers, ships damaged, ships sunk, artillery, air defense weapons, and other heavy equipment. Ships, aircraft and missiles, helicopters, aircraft, tanks and artillery, aircraft and a helicopter, tanks and artillery. Ships, a secure bridgehead firmly established, a secure base, landings not opposed. Warships sunk, a sea harrier missing, aircraft shot down, helicopters destroyed on the ground. Missiles and guns replying. Troops, commandos, regiment, casualties, some prisoners taken, troops, garrison, troops, men, 21 are feared dead, the loss of many young lives, troops ferried in without their equipment. The meeting was adjourned until later today. Public emergency sessions, mass for peace arranged. If you do get a chance, I encourage you to listen to more of the Cities in Memory project on Shortwave. Lots of history there and interpretations of that history. Speaking of history and events in Europe right now, there's an interesting story up at the SWLing Post about why you need a shortwave radio. And yeah, I'm sure the radio folks here out there, watching right now don't need to be convinced. But it's interesting how many in my circles don't have radios or only have them in cars. I live in Tornado Alley, so we do get the you need a weather radio PSAs pretty often, but I think it's larger than that. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but I'll just put a link to that post in the description of this video. And speaking of radios, let's talk radios. At the risk of doing the YouTube version of those personal web pages in the 1990s and the early 2000s where people would list all of their CDs. I'm sure if you're old enough, you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about in this and in upcoming videos, I'm going to mention radios that I have, what I have and why I have them. Not many videos because I don't have that many radios. So anyway, this will not be a review. And why am I not reviewing them? I haven't spent the hours of hands-on time with lots of different technology to take really deep, insightful looks at radios. Just don't have the time and the resources for that. And this is more important. I think I live in kind of a bad area for RFI interference and electronic noise. Most of us do right now. So anyway, I'm not in a good location to make judgments based on the thing in itself versus my neighbor's collection of giant televisions and all the LED lights everywhere around here. I'm not knocking any of that. I'm just saying that it makes listening a lot harder. Before I bring out the Tecson PL-380, I want to talk about this thing. It's a Coby CX-CB91. Not a stellar example of shortwave technology, but this was my first foray into shortwave. I probably got it because it was cheap and I was in the middle of paying off student loans at the time. This was probably 2010 or so, and I remember getting WWV, the 10 megahertz station, and lots of religious content. Some music too, but mostly just religious content. This isn't a good AM radio, and I should put batteries in it to show this off, but in addition to not being a very sensitive piece of equipment, the tuner starts moving itself. It's really weird. Anyway, so I gave up on this thing really fast. Years later, I was still interested in shortwave, and I knew from owning Sony and Sangean and AM and FM radios that better radios were out there. So in 2018, I bought the Tecson PL-380. After doing a lot of reading and a lot of watching videos, just a lot of research on this, and I was shocked. Yeah, after the Coby, I was really shocked. This thing picked up so much more of everything. I like this a lot for AM and FM too, but I got it for shortwave listening, and I discovered REE out of Spain. I could really easily hear Brazil, Greece, NHK out of Japan, BBC out of the VOA transmitter in the Philippines, and I even heard a couple of times radio kind of great just fiddling out around in my backyard over the years. And this is in my really noisy backyard. I would like to take the Tecson out in the middle of nowhere. I just haven't had the chance to do that too much. So this is the one that I use the most, definitely. I have a Radiowow R108, but and I really like that one too, but this one I've definitely got more hands-on time listening to. So even though the Tecson was not my first shortwave radio, it was really my entry into listening. I do regret not getting something better in the first place, and say being able to hear Radio Canada International, which stopped broadcasting in 2012, I think. But I have what I have now, and I appreciate that. Larger point here, I'm in the if you fail, don't give up. The Coby was definitely a failure, but I got back into the hobby and got the Tecson. I'll talk a little bit more about listening with that radio in another video, but I will say for now that it was an eye-opener, or an ear-opener, really. And to wrap up, more poetry, this time what I'm reading. I'm going to step back and say there's a question that keeps coming up about science poetry, or really, it's not science poetry, it's just poetry that engages with concepts out of science, and about why write poetry that engages with science. And I think it's valid to step back even farther and ask why poetry. Lots of folks have already addressed that, and I might do another video talking specifically about that later. Today I'm just going to talk about, to answer that question from my perspective, why poetry. I'm going to talk about a little bit about what I've read lately and why, and maybe that will suffice for an answer to the why poetry question for right now. During the pandemic, I've been reading a lot of old favorites of late, lots of Jory Graham, Louise Glick, Ray Armentrout, Charles Simic, Lucy Brock-Broido, and so on. I could go But I come to each of these poets for something very different. Recently I read Matt Rasmussen's Black Aperture, which is about loss and about mortality. And before that I read Lucy Brock-Bordeaux's Stay Illusion, which is also about mortality, but it's about wonder at the same time. And it's about visiting these moments of attention, intense attention to things. Lyrical attention, musical attention. One of my favorite poets, probably my very favorite poet for a lot of reasons, is Louise Glick, and I just finished her collection Faithful and Virtuous Night. Some of the book's poems told the story, not the whole narrative, but like the story, the emotion, and really sparse details of someone who loses his parents when he's very young and how he deals with that through the arc of his life. And I felt on finishing the book of poems the same satisfaction I do when I read a long novel, and that just draws me into the world for a really long time. So I guess I don't see reading poetry as all that different from reading fiction. I don't really hear people asking why fiction in the same way as people ask why poetry. We read to be immersed in another world, to see things through other eyes, really. And poetry and prose are just different ways to get there in a lot of ways. So that's it for me today. I'd love to hear what you're reading, what you're listening to, and what you're listening to through that, I suppose. I could say it that way. How you're listening to what you're listening is probably a better way to say it. If you'd like a recommendation for poetry books, drop a note in the comments about with what kind of fiction or even nonfiction that you like reading, and I'd be more than happy to suggest a poetry collection or two that you might enjoy. Thanks for watching, and 73s, y'all.